Good morning and welcome to the Morning Scoop for Wednesday, March 10th. This is your daily Buckeye Fix. I'm Tom Orr. The Minnesota game is in 176 days, the game against Michigan in 262 days. The Buckeye football program paused all team activities yesterday after an increase in positive COVID testing numbers. They are expected to be back in 7 days and start spring football next Friday as scheduled, so you can put down the panic button, at least for now. Tony Gurderman and I talked about that in a lot more detail on the episode of Buckeye Weekly that dropped yesterday, so you can listen to that if you want to get a bunch more on what's going on inside the Woody Hayes right now. Today, though, we are talking about FOIA. And if you follow me on Twitter, late last week, you may have seen me angrily tweeting about what may have seemed like to you maybe a fairly insignificant story in the Washington Post. It was about some Big Ten university presidents trying to find a way to avoid having to turn over communications related to last fall's decision-making process around whether to have students return to campus, play a fall football season, all that good stuff. This all centers around the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA. That is a federal law that requires public officials to turn over certain documents upon request. It is something that journalists use all the time as a resource to hold public officials accountable, but it's also something that you, dear listener, have every bit as right to request as either I or my guest does. So something that you might want to at least know about. That guest is Matt Brown. He is the publisher of the Extra Points newsletter, the host of the Going for Two podcast, and perhaps most importantly, a native of lovely Granville, Ohio. Matt, thank you for joining me.
It is a pleasure. Always happy to be here, and always a pleasure to talk to somebody else that knows about the 740 area code.
Living that life every day, baby. Your newsletter on Monday this week. This is the Extra Points newsletter. I'm going to plug it now. I'm going to plug it at the end. Subscribe to the Extra Points newsletter. Matt can tell you how to do that later on, but absolutely worth a read. Monday's newsletter went into a lot of detail on this issue and why it really is a big deal, not just for people who are reporting in college sports, but for everyone. I have typically used FOIA to get documents from Ohio State like football game contracts, performance reviews of coaches, even phone and text records related to the Urban Meyer Zach Smith situation a few years ago. So any kind of documents like that, you can get them that way. You, though, Matt, do a lot more with those. Let people know kind of what kinds of things you're requesting through FOIA and then how you do it for people who haven't done that before.
Sure. So every state has slightly different open records rules, but generally speaking, if you are the internal emails, all of the contracts, vendor agreements, financial information for any public institution is available for inspection for everybody. I can do it as a journalist. You can do it. Any taxpayer can do it. And in most states, you don't even have to be a resident of that particular state. You just send an email and ask for the very specific documents. One thing that I use a lot for my newsletter, since I write a lot about the business of college athletics and some of the policies and connections to universities themselves and how those shape college sports, I do a lot of requests for financial data. I have on my computer right now probably 130 annual financial reports that tell you how much money individual schools made from ticket sales, how much they spend on scholarships, how much they get from their television media rights, which is important because then, 3 months later, a story comes up about, say, Cincinnati's new apparel contract or a smaller school potentially changing conferences. Well, I have the record, so I can look chapter and verse and give you the correct information to make that story a little bit more insightful and accurate and provide some context. It's also, I think, a really important tool to help illustrate what fans and boosters think about particular issues. Going back to this summer, enormously controversial time for every Big Ten university, you could use open records to find out what boosters or fans or regents or other members in the community were emailing an athletic director or a university president to get a better understanding of how those institutions are responding in real time and what kinds of political and local pressure they might be facing one way or another. And I think that's important, not just for nosy dorks like me, but I think that's important for all taxpayers, because at the end of the day, your university president, particularly if you're in the Big Ten, where they're a land grant university, they're supposed to be serving the interests of not just students on campus, but ultimately providing value for the entire state. And so you should be able to use these records to help get an idea, not just of the final result, but a better idea of the process. And we should be able to make evaluations of how our administrators look at inputs and outputs and make decisions, just like we might with our mayor, just like we might with an elected official. So, like when I hear about universities trying to get around complying to this rule, it doesn't just make my life harder as a blogger. I really think it can it disadvantages you, just like Joe Q taxpayer in Ohio or Illinois.
Yeah, and another place you might have seen FOIA recently was the Eyes of Texas with all the booster emails. Like that was all FOIA. That was someone who FOIA'd
Yep.
those booster emails and then got turned into a pretty big story. The story that came out in the Washington Post on Friday was it was this like weird mix of infuriating and funny to me because you've got these university presidents and chancellors. Michigan's Mark Schlissel and Wisconsin's Rebecca Blank were the two that sort of turned into the main characters of the story, but there were other names in there as well, talking about how to communicate in a way that's not subject to FOIA in a format that's subject to FOIA. So they're emailing, which is subject to FOIA, yet they're talking about how can we get around FOIA? At one point, Schlissel sent an email. This is a epidemiologist. This is a very intelligent man in charge of the University of Michigan. Sent an email that said, I'm going to read you the direct quote. If you simply delete emails after sending, does that relieve you of FOIA obligations? And like, man, I know I'm supposed to be mad, but that is also, it just kind of left me like kind of laughing and shaking my head too.
Yeah, my dude, it does not. Like this is just like, if I delete the records of the crime, does that mean that the crime didn't happen? Like, no, like generally people go to jail for white collar crimes like that. Like obviously like getting around open records requests, that's not a felony. It's not like a capital C crime. It is stupid to see these educated people who should know better, colluding in print about how to get around it. I think in the newsletter I talked about it reminds me of Kyle Flood when he was at Rutgers as just like the world's dumbest academic scandal ever. Like, I am emailing you from my personal account, so I am not encouraging you to change a grade. Like, you're no idiot. Like you made the record here. If you're gonna crime, you got to do a better job than criming than that.
Yeah, that was the Kyle Flood story. Like, man, there were so many layers to why that was a bad decision. It was just bad decision piled on bad decision piled on bad decision.
Yeah.
This particular open records request was part of the Big Ten's decision to play football or not. That was, that's the part that obviously this audience probably cares most about.
Yeah.
But also whether it was safe to return to campus or not, at all, like this fall. That is a pretty big decision, the kind of thing that seems like the public has a pretty vested interest in, because if it goes well or doesn't, that's a big difference for a university budget wise. It could also, literally could be life or death for some people in this case. So, that seems like exactly the kind of thing that FOIA was designed for. But in your experience, it sounds like the overall trend right now for schools has been to fight these requests more than they used to. So what kinds of things are they, in your experience, making it harder to get now? And how are they doing that?
Unfortunately, I think especially post-COVID, it's gotten harder almost everywhere across the country. And part of that is just through stalling. And it might be because, hey, if your university is facing a huge budget crunch and you lay off a couple of your clerks and nobody can come on campus to physically inspect any records, the law might let them just stall. So I might send a very basic request to UCLA for a game contract, and I might not get it for 5 or 6 months. Usually if you run out the clock that long, it's not newsworthy anymore, or it's not as newsworthy. So if you're trying to bury bad news, you just stall. And I filed very similar requests to most Pac-12 university presidents about the same decision-making of whether to play and whether not to play. And the two most common ways of getting around it were either to just wait, which sometimes the state lets you do, or charge you a lot of money. So in most states, typically an open record request should be free. But if you are asking a university to search for a particular kind of document, or if you're asking for something that's more expansive than just one game contract or a single PDF, some states will charge you. And some states might charge you an exorbitant amount of money. I remember one time I asked the University of Georgia for a stupid request. I was asking for emails about Darren Ravel. Like, I was doing a story about weird emails that he was sending to people, right? And Georgia tries to charge me $18,000. I'm like, that's more than my car. For a couple of yucks about, and then of course I tweeted about it and they came back and changed their mind. So schools will use fees. They'll just stall. Unfortunately, this is something Ohio State does. And then in many other states, the law allows them to limit what they share. And this is, I think, a very unfortunate development across the country, that you would think that taxpayers and voters would want more accountability, not just from their universities, but this law also works for your mayor. This law works for many federal offices. It works for your state government. It works for your police department. You'd think that you'd want increased government transparency, particularly as government often grows. But instead, what you're finding across the country is lawmakers are increasingly making these laws weaker and more narrow. At Georgia, the famous example that Kirby Smart allegedly helped was to expand the window of response time for any Georgia institution to like 90 days. So trying to now get anything out of anybody out of that state is very hard. Kentucky is about to change the law that says you have to be a Kentucky resident to file any kind of request, which is going to make financial data much more difficult. And like this is I understand this is not the sexiest political issue in the world, but to me, it's not a conservative or a liberal thing or anything. It's, do you want to know what your institutions are doing? And regardless of how you feel ideologically, I would imagine that that more transparency and accountability is good. And so you should encourage your state lawmakers, because particularly when it comes to college athletics, those are the ones that set these laws, to make sure that not only do they create open records laws with some teeth and have expanded definitions of what constitutes a record, but will penalize schools for noncompliance. Because what typically happens is a school might say, yes, the law compels me to give you this document. I'm not going to do it. Sue me. And if you are a gigantic newspaper, if you're USA Today, sometimes you'll sue them. And that's why we have Les Miles information now in public, because they won that lawsuit. But I don't know about you guys. I'm a sole operator, and I don't have First Amendment lawyers in every state on retainer that I can come back with. So I've occasionally done this paperwork. I haven't done appeals, but it's expensive and it's hard for me to do. And it's probably hard for you guys to do in Ohio, where so many local newspapers have been nuked. Most people don't have that money or time anymore. And that doesn't benefit the reader. It doesn't benefit the taxpayer. It benefits the institution that has something to hide.
Yeah, and I mean, the Georgia example is just such a shining example of why this is a bigger deal than it seems like, because it's like, well, this started right after Kirby Smart took that job. I mean, there were all sorts of reports that Kirby Smart was sort of at the center of getting that law changed. And it's like, yep, that doesn't just impact the Georgia football program. That impacts the whole state. That's a big deal. Penn State has kind of a special carve out, I believe, in Pennsylvania law as well. This is
Delaware too.
Yeah. There's just it's just very strange that you'd have college sports driving like the law for the whole state. That's just bizarre to me. And that's even maybe. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you're absolutely right, and it's frustrating, and also it doesn't even really help the athletic department that much. Like, Kirby Smart was out here saying, like, listen, we got to restrict this FOIA law because people are going to be trying to FOIA our recruiting records and figure out our secrets. I'm like, no, moron. Like, anybody with a 247 subscription knows who is visiting Georgia. The 16-year-olds are tweeting it themselves. There are no state secrets. The state secret is how the bagman works. And you're probably not going to figure that out with FOIA, because any bagman who's worth a crap is using a burner phone. Like the wanton Tennessee McDonald's bag examples are rare. And those people also don't typically create phone records that you can FOIA. It's just a matter of secrecy, I think, for secrecy's sake. And that hurts, I think, a lot of people.
Yeah, these are not university presidents typically delivering the bag of McDonald's money. So that's probably not a FOIA issue there.
No,
the other side of this, it's a little. I mean, like, we've talked about some stuff it's kind of amusing. Like, the other side of this that's less amusing is, like, you've had major scandals and allegations of other scandals about possible cover-ups at Ohio State with, like, Richard Strauss, Michigan with Dr. Robert Anderson, Michigan State with Larry Nassar, Penn State Jerry Sandusky. That has all come out in the last decade. That is just schools in the Big Ten East. Like, to me, it seems like, of all times, this is a period when Big Ten schools should be trying to be more transparent, not less. And yet, for presumably short-term, reasons, they seem to be going the other direction.
You're absolutely right. For as much as I think the Big Ten culturally likes to brag about doing things the right way, right, and having this increased focus on academic integrity, that especially compared to some places in the South, that's part of. And I'm a Big Ten grad myself, right? I went to Ohio State. You have to juxtapose that with the fact that almost every school at this point has had a massive athletic related scandal over the last decade. Not just those schools. A kid died at Maryland. Rutgers has had like 3 or 4 different abuse related scandals. All of these schools have struggles with Title IX compliance, both in terms of sports sponsorship and actually protecting women on campus. And I look at this as not automatically just big time college athletics are corrupt thing. I think it's an institutional thing. If we poked around local government, or if we poked around gigantic businesses or any other large institution that's not used to people being held accountable, you're going to find some of these issues. And I would completely agree, right? Like, part of the value system that I think you're taught to associate with this conference when you grow up in the Midwest is that we're going to try to do things the right way. And if you want to live up to that value, that means I think you have to embrace it, even when it's complicated or unpleasant. If we collectively want to make sure that these terrible scandals don't keep happening. And I'm not saying that FOIA alone is going to do that, but if high level administrators feel an increased sense of accountability, I do think it is less likely to occur. And I don't think it's an accident that in places where you're not seeing that very much, bad behavior tends to continue.
All right. And last question. I'm going to let you go on this. This is perhaps the biggest one of all. What was it like? What was your favorite part of growing up in lovely Granville, Ohio?
I love Licking County. I'm based in Chicago now, but I lived in Pataskala for a long time. I grew up and graduated from Granville, and this is so funny because I married. My wife's a city kid. She grew up just outside of Chicago. She went to Evanston, and I could tell her, and this is honest to God true. When I lived in Granville, my neighbor had a zebra. Like you have seen the zebra, right?
I have seen the zebra. Yes.
You drive down Route 37, and right as you hit Silver Street, there was a yak, there was a reindeer, there were peacocks, and there was a zebra. And what sucked about it is, if I remember correctly, the fence that separates those animals from the rest of the houses on Cali Court and Route 37 is like 2 feet. So animals would just escape. There's a picture of me somewhere headed to my junior prom in a tuxedo, chasing down a goat because the thing just got away and was running down the street. My dad in his pickup truck hit a peacock once, and then had like the big gigantic peacock feathers stuck in like the grill of his truck. Like it was a great place to grow up. And every once in a while, I just remember now living in a big city, like, oh yeah, this is not even a especially country place. It's very different from Chicago.
Yeah, that is quite a difference. Yeah, when I'm out there for Big Ten Media Days, it's like I'm looking around, I'm like, oh, we are definitely not in Granville anymore. I'm going to let you share some information on how to subscribe to Extra Points in the Going for Two podcast. But first, I would like to get a plug in that both of them are really, really fantastic resources, covering elements of college football that are really underreported, I think, in a lot of places. You've done a ton of really great work on topics like why the conventional wisdom about schools adding and dropping sports may be completely wrong. Everyone's favorite, you mentioned earlier, conference realignment. Everyone loves a good conference realignment. And then another really good one that I saw earlier, and I thought, I need to have Matt on to talk about this, then I never did it. Why the city of Chicago doesn't produce a lot of high-level football recruits. Like, that was a really interesting one. And it's just like, if you are a college football person, like, this is all really interesting stuff. And like, the dorkier a college football person you are, the more you will enjoy it. So you should sign up. That is my TLDR. You should sign up. So Matt, let them know how they can do that, and also about your podcast.
Thank you very much. Listen, the people who are into the dorkier stuff, those are my people. Like, if you're right, because like you look at the city of Chicago, capital of the Midwest, important recruiting territory, generally produces less really good football players than Cincinnati, like a much smaller place. And I asked around, and that's a story about population change and charter schools and parochial schools and high school basketball and all these other little things. And that's part of what makes this whole sport interesting. So if you're interested in how everything about this entire operation actually works, like, this is not a newsletter that's going to break down the Ohio State depth chart. Buckeye Scoop is great for that. If you want to know how Ohio State athletics gets its money and where it's spending it and what that means for Case Western, what that means for like the Ohio as a whole, I think you'd like Extra Points, which you can find at www.extrapointsmb.com, MB for Matt Brown. You can subscribe for free and get 2 newsletters a week, or you could a paid subscription gives you 4. It gives you access to our chat room. That's just $7 a month. That helps keep independent journalism working. And you can also subscribe to the Going for Two podcast. That's me and Brian Fisher of Athlon Sports, digging into many of these similar stories in a way that doesn't really fit in a 1,500-word newsletter. And you can find that wherever you get your podcasts.
Awesome. Well, I would encourage you to subscribe to both of those. They are, again, a really, really good resource. Stuff that I use, stuff that has taught me a lot. I've learned a lot reading Matt's stuff over the last few years, and would encourage you to do that as well. So, Matt, thank you very much for joining me.
No problem, Tom. Anytime. Thanks.
And in addition to the Extra Points newsletter and the Going for Two podcast, also make sure you check out BuckeyeScoop.com. We have a ton of great coverage, have stories about the shutdown, what it's going to mean potentially for the Ohio State football program as they head into spring football next week. The Ohio State men's basketball team will tip off their Big Ten tournament play on Thursday. That's coming up pretty soon. We'll have coverage of that. Tony Gerdeman will be in Indianapolis to cover all of that action. And lots of interesting stuff as well on the recruiting front, as one of Ohio State's big name targets just pushed back his decision. Talked about Givler a little bit about that yesterday, why that's going to be a big deal, but lots of other great coverage as well. That's all at BuckeyeScoop.com. Also, make sure you check out all of our great podcasts. In addition to Matt's, we have shows on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spreaker, Spotify, you name it, we're there. Just search Buckeye Scoop to find all of those. You can subscribe right there. Also leave us a 5-star rating or review. And also subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Buckeye Scoop. You can just find just about everything we do, our podcasts, interviews with players and coaches, highlights from camps, highlights from workouts, interviews with recruits. It's all there at youtube.com/Buckeye Scoop. And if you hit that subscribe button right there, it doesn't cost you anything. It takes half a second, and then you will get a notification every time we put a new video up. So if you think, hey, that looks like something I would be interested in watching, it's coming right there to your phone. We could not possibly make this easier for you. All you have to do is go to youtube.com/Buckeye Scoop to sign up there. Just hit the subscribe button. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys for joining us. Have a great day. We will talk to you tomorrow.